Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mass Office Hours, brought to you by the Mass Research Review. As always, it is Wednesday night. It is 7 p.m. Eastern Time, which means we are ready for another episode. Tonight, I am joined by the good Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. Lauren, how's it going?
Going great. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's been a few weeks, so I'm sure people in the chat are dying to hear from you. I know they get a little bit bored of seeing me every week, and I am still here, but I'm going to kick a bunch of questions to you and make sure that people get what they came for. But before we get to Q&A stuff, a couple regular things we do at the beginning of the show here. We are going to have a little short segment on bulking. And also I need to do a little bit of housekeeping. So folks, you know the drill. If you like the show, if you want to support it, there's many ways to do it. We appreciate all forms of support. But make sure you like, rate, subscribe, review. If you're in the YouTube live chat right now, make sure you like the video. Make sure you share it with a friend if you can. Preferably someone with really good taste who enjoys good content. So share the link to our Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, whatever you like. And of course, if you really love what we're doing, you could actually become part of the show. We do not have any openings for guest hosts, but you can join the live chat on YouTube and ask questions live, or you can submit questions after hours following the link in the show notes. That is massresearchreview.com/office hours with a hyphen between office and hours. And then, of course, the best way to support us, the Mass Research Review is the lifeblood of this whole operation. It funds everything we do. It is the backstop of this entire thing. So if you love what we're doing and you want to throw a couple dollars in the jar, you could think about subscribing to the Mass Research Review. You can learn more about that at massresearchreview.com. Now, Lauren and chat. I've got good news and I've got better news. So the good news is that beach swimsuit season, whatever you call it, it's coming to a close if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm seeing August on the calendar. Students are moving in to the campus dorms. We're really wrapping it up. That means we got probably about a month before we are fully out of that season. So that's a good thing because that means it's time to bulk up. It's time to get beefy. The even better news is that college football is coming. We're like 2 weeks from kickoff. It's going to be incredible. And I don't even know, 2 weeks, I forget if that's week 0 or week 1 of the season. But either way, I can't wait. I have legitimately thought about, like, what if I just turned some content I do into like a pure college football piece of content? You know, I don't know what it would be. I've thought about creating my own like personal college football podcast because I am obsessed with it. So folks, there are good things on the horizon. I'm not going to spam the audience with any college football talk tonight, but I do want to talk a little bit about bulking because I know as the leaves start to change colors and people put away the swim trunks, get out the hoodies, all of a sudden it's time to start getting beefy for the colder months. And I was recently putting together some slides, and we always get questions from people about, hey, I want to bulk up this winter. From a diet perspective, what should I be doing? What kind of targets can I be aiming for? So before we get into the live Q&A questions, I wanted to give a quick rundown of how I like to approach the nutritional side of bulking up and gaining weight. So Lauren, no offense, but you are currently not visible on the screen. I am showing some slides that I put together here. And folks, I would say, if you're going to be trying to put on some weight in the coming months, you want to make sure that you have your priorities in order, right? So you can see right here on the screen is what some might call a pyramid. I would not call it that because of my fear of litigation from Eric Helms. He actually trademarked everything that has to do with pyramids, including the pyramids in Egypt. But this triangular structure kind of shows the priorities in order. So the base of the pyramid, the base of the triangle, most important part is just having the right amount of calories for a bulk. It's going to be critical. After that, you want to make sure you have enough protein. After that, you want to make sure you have enough carbs. After that, you want to make sure you have adequate amounts of fat in the diet. And then after you have all those boxes checked, you might think about adding in some supplements. Now, like I said, I'm only talking about the nutritional elements of bulking up because, Lauren, this is something you and I have talked about previously in various places, but if you're not completing and engaged in a good, solid, progressive resistance training program, none of this stuff really matters. Resistance training, the training stimulus, is what actually stimulates growth. The nutritional elements, and especially calories and protein, these are elements that have a permissive effect. They allow you to make the most of the stimulus that has been induced by training. So folks have probably seen this figure from Murphy and colleagues. Really cool project, a good meta-regression that we reviewed in mass a couple years back. But the main point of this paper that people really focused on was the fact that when folks are training without an energy deficit, looking at all these different studies, looking at panel B of this figure in the bottom left, people tend to gain lean mass. That's a good thing, and that makes sense. However, if you look above that in panel A, the top left, when people do resistance training studies with an energy deficit, actually more likely than not, there could be a loss of lean mass, depending on, of course, all the many characteristics of the actual intervention. But all of that is to say, when you add a deficit in there, you often make it more challenging to build considerable amounts of lean mass in a resistance training protocol. Now, for this meta-regression, what they found was that deficits of above about 500 calories a day were, that was right about where they said, okay, that seems to be the point at which your deficit's getting a little bit too large. It might be particularly difficult to gain lean mass. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule. That's not a law of physics nor a law of human physiology. It's simply an estimate. It's where the regression line crosses zero. They found when people had energy deficits greater than 500 calories per day, that's when they started to be a little bit more likely to actually turn that corner, and instead of gaining lean mass, there was a possibility that they would be, or a likelihood that they would actually be losing small amounts of lean mass, which of course, not what we're going for. Now, the main thing I want to cover here before we dive into the chat, I'm not going to get into all the specifics. There's a lot of ins and outs with a bulking diet. But the biggest thing, and the bottom of that triangular structure, is eating the right amount of calories. And I think that's the one area where there's the most misconceptions when it comes to bulking up. So without question, this is the figure on the screen here is just a plot showing what I call a lean gains metric from an old participant level meta-analysis that I did when I was talking about P ratios. And I've mentioned that whole back and forth the last couple weeks in office hours here. The main moral of this story is you want to make sure that you are adequately fueled and have plenty of energy if muscle growth is the goal. So, folks who are super, super lean and not actively trying to gain weight, very, very unlikely that you're going to be bulking up. So if you're shredded and you're like, well, I'm just going to maintain and try to recomp here, and that's my version of bulking for the winter, probably not going to happen, So I would encourage people, if, for example, you are a male and you're at like 6, 7, 8% body fat, it may be hard to meaningfully gain fat-free mass without accepting some degree of fat gain along the way. And I would say the same is true for females. So for males, like I said, if you're in those like mid single digit to high single digit ranges for body fat percentage, it's going to be tough. And the analogous number for females is usually adding about 7 or 8 percentage points to that. So we're talking more the mid to high teens would be that super, super shredded point. So first things first, you want to make sure that you're giving yourself a chance to, to really grow here. But of course, most folks are already out of that super shredded zone, and they're saying, okay, I'm at a healthy, sustainable, comfortable body fat level. But from here, how much extra calories, how much extra energy do I actually need to facilitate, a reasonable rate of muscle growth? Now, in order to answer that question, we first have to ask, how many calories are we likely to be burning in our training and in our day-to-day life? And that reminds me of this really cool study by, I believe the lead author's name was Zhao and colleagues, but They looked at a few very different resistance training protocols to see how many calories people were burning during fairly typical resistance training programs. And ultimately, they found that energy expenditure tended to be around 6 calories per minute for resistance training in general. Now, of course, that's going to differ based on high reps versus low reps, long rest periods versus short rest periods, the type of exercises you're doing, your training split. Of course, there's going to be a lot of variables. But, what they found was across this huge range of resistance training protocols, people were burning, maybe 300, 400, 500 calories per workout. Now, that's not a ton. And you have to also remember that even if they were doing nothing at all, they would have burnt calories during that time as well. So this is not the added expenditure of training. This is training, which includes resting plus, the extra muscular effort. And of course, we have to keep in mind that because of exercise energy compensation, just because you burn an extra 300 or 400 calories during a workout does not necessarily mean that you've increased your total daily energy expenditure by exactly that many calories. In fact, most likely your net impact on total daily energy expenditure will be less than that. And then, of course, we have to also consider in our goal with fueling when we're trying to bulk up is not merely to replace the calories that have been burned throughout the day, but also to make sure we have adequate calories to facilitate the building of new proteins, which is a process that does consume energy. So we have to replace the calories that were lost and then ideally provide a small extra bit of calories so that we can fuel that additional growth. Now, a lot of people tend to go way overboard when they bulk. And I remember when I was in college, especially like sophomore year, man, I just went for it and gained so much weight. And my experience was not one I would recommend necessarily. And it looked a lot like this figure here by Garth and colleagues. I'm sure that I'm pronouncing their name incorrectly, but basically in this study, they looked at two different rates of weight gain in really well-trained people, really well-trained athletes. And they were interested in seeing if you could kind of really speed up muscle growth and fat and lean body mass accretion by pushing the calories pretty aggressively. What they found was comparing fast versus slow weight gain. Changes in lean body mass were actually pretty similar during the bulking period, but changes in fat mass were very different. And so basically what they found was if you try to rush the process by force feeding calories, you're probably going to have a negligible effect, maybe a very slight effect on lean body mass, but a very, very large effect on fat mass accretion. And a recent study by our dear friend Eric Helms and colleagues largely served to reinforce that point. They found that faster rates of weight gain, also, by extension, large energy surpluses, primarily increased the rate of fat gain rather than augmenting maximal strength or muscle thickness. So we got to be a little cautious with that. Now, I do want to highlight when we look at the energy expenditure of like really active athletes, like people who are up and down the field training like crazy on top of their resistance training, like, people that are really getting after it. This is a heck of a lot more than getting in the gym a few days a week and moving the iron around. When we look at doubly labeled water studies and we say, well, how many calories does an athlete actually burn per day? You look at the studies on soccer players, and it's in the 2,900 to 3,600 calorie per day range. Rugby, those athletes tend to have bigger bodies. Those numbers tend to be in the 3,800 to 5,800 calories per day range. Basketball players, that's more in the 4,000 to 4,900 calories per day range. So these are high numbers, but these are not like, every few years the Olympics come around and people say, oh yeah, this athlete eats 12,000 calories per day. Generally speaking, that's not the case. We have done a lot of research. When I say we, I mean the collective, exercise science world. when we actually control and look at in a high level of detail how much energy calories are eating, we find that endurance athletes, even in those periods when they are burning crazy amounts of calories, like during the Tour de France, it is a battle trying to replace those calories. And people really struggle to eat more than about 2.5 times their basal metabolic rate. So usually we're talking about in like the 6,000 calorie range for a lot of folks. It's exceedingly difficult to eat any more than that. But anyway, so when we're thinking about, okay, what kind of calorie range should I bulk on? A lot of people think they need to jump to like 5,000 calories a day. And like, probably not, right? If your exercise involves maybe 5 total hours of traditional resistance training a week, you probably aren't burning what a soccer player is burning, and you almost certainly aren't burning what a rugby player is burning on average. And this is a really interesting study that I just covered in Mass here, looking at sumo athletes who were, these are young athletes at baseline. I think they're about 100 kilos in terms of body mass, and they were like 15 years old on average. So they were also growing. So they were big, they were training, they were growing. And over a 6-month period, their energy surplus averaged 5.6 calories per day. So just barely in the smallest possible caloric surplus. And what they found was these sumo athletes during a training period were burning about 4,200 calories per day. So it's really important to contextualize, like for bulking, we really don't need to go super high. Like if we've got sumo athletes who are actually gaining muscle, and in positive energy balance, and they're looking at about 4,200 calories per day. And like I said, you got soccer players who are running up and down the field all day, putting in several miles a game, and they're burning 3,400 calories per day. You probably don't need to be going super high with your calories even during a bulking phase. Maybe you do end up in the 3,200, 3,400, maybe 4,000 calories per day range if you happen to be fairly large. But for the vast majority of people, the difference between really solid bulking calories and just comfortable maintenance calories at a very comfortable, stable body weight, it doesn't end up being a massive shift in calories. And that's kind of the main point I wanted to make. And I wanted to throw some numbers on that so people could kind of see what that looks like in different athletic populations. Now, if you're going to actually set a calorie target, the last thing I'll mention here, you want to think about whether you're going to be bulking in a manner that is aggressive, very moderate, or conservative, or if you basically are just trying to shoot for like maintenance level calories and see if you maybe gain a little muscle along the way. So those are kind of my 3 calories. And where you fall, between aggressive, moderate, and just kind of maintenance, that's going to depend on a few factors. So one is training status. If you are a beginner, you can get away with a more aggressive bulk. If you're super advanced, it probably doesn't make sense to try to gain slabs of muscle, because that's going to be pretty tough to do if you're highly advanced. Your starting weight, if you just started lifting and you're 5'10", 130 pound male, you can probably get away with a really aggressive bulk and start filling out your frame. In contrast, if you're already 280 pounds and at that 5'10" height, probably doesn't make as much sense to go on a super aggressive bulk from there. Another one is just a matter of preference, and what I mean there is your aversion to fat gain. Some people are very comfortable trusting the process and saying, I don't mind gaining a little fat, I can go a little more aggressive with it. Other people really don't want to gain fat or an appreciable amount of fat, and so they go a little bit more conservative, and that's totally fine. And then finally, the last factor is urgency. If you are in a hurry to get huge, obviously you're going to go more aggressive. If you are comfortable, focusing on the long run, taking your time with it, that's fantastic, and you can go with a much more conservative approach to bulking. So once you figure out where you want to fall on that spectrum of conservative or, basically no surplus, all the way up to a very aggressive large surplus, then you want to think about, what are the different ways to kind of estimate your caloric needs. One is a very, very simple heuristic where you just do a number of calories per pound of body weight. So A really aggressive bulk would be like 19 calories per pound of body weight in terms of setting your target for caloric intake. And then that spectrum goes all the way down. A lot of people will maintain if they're at around 14 or 15 calories per pound. Of course, that's not going to be true for everybody, but that's kind of a basic heuristic to go with. Another option you have is to use any number. There's a million of calculators out there to help you estimate your total daily energy expenditure, and you can just set your calorie target as a percentage of that number. So if you were going really aggressive, you might set it at 115 or 120% of your total daily energy expenditure. If you were going for a more conservative bulk, it'd be maybe 105, 110%, and then maintenance obviously would be 100%. And then finally, probably the best way to do it, in my opinion, is to, instead of doing all these guesses and estimates, to just kind of monitor your caloric intake and monitor your rate of weight gain and kind of see how your body weight is changing. And the units there, we're going to be talking about percentage of body weight gained per week. And so if you were on a pretty aggressive bulk, you might be gaining 0.25% of your body weight per week, or in some cases even more. A more conservative approach to bulking would be 0.1 to 0.25% of your body weight gained per week. And then, of course, maintenance would be a stable body weight of 0%. So obviously, if you saw, I was kind of skipping through this slideshow here that actually has 55 slides in it. So this is just the highlights, but in honor of cold weather and leaves changing colors and football coming, even though it's still very hot where I am, I'm getting super ready for fall. And I wanted to give folks a little look at how I typically view and approach bulking calories as we transition to that season. So Lauren, you are back on the screen. Anything to add to that or any commentary before we dive into the live chat?
I really don't care about college football.
What do you mean though?
Just no interest. I won't be following your new podcast or YouTube channel or however you plan on communicating with the public. So
here's the thing. Like, when I hear someone say that, I don't want to argue with them, and I don't want to defend college football. It just makes me sad, you know? It makes me sad that you don't have this in your life when you could, and you simply choose not to. All I'm going to say is the tradition, the fanfare, the pageantry. College football is the best sport that has ever existed, and I do worry about some trends in how it's restructuring, but I'm sure everything will be fine because you can't break college football. It is the purest institution, and whatever happens, it will work out for the best because that's how faith works. But yeah, anyway, real folks in the live chat know that we're getting stoked about college football. We're 2 weeks away, and once it gets going, it is a wild ride. But Lauren, let's jump into the live chat. And first off, we got folks talking about dairy. Okay, so someone asked thoughts on number one, if dairy being attributed to high inflammation is accurate. And then number two, thoughts on whole food vegan diets for longevity. I'd love to take a crack at this one because I was looking at a meta-analysis by Kristen Neiman and colleagues in 2021. They looked at the effects of dairy products in 19 trials, looking at effects on various inflammation biomarkers. Of those 19, 10 reported no effect or no significant effect on inflammation markers, and 8 actually reported a reduction in at least one biomarker of inflammation. So for looking just at averages within these studies, it seems very difficult to suggest that dairy is inherently inflammatory. I will acknowledge I don't know what that would look like for someone who has lactose intolerance. I don't know if the GI disturbance that they experience would be accompanied by any detectable biomarker response indicating inflammation. simply don't know enough about that. But I would also say if you're eating anything that's causing you substantial GI symptoms, probably just for several reasons, a better idea to minimize your intake of that thing. Now, the other part of the question was where to go. Whole food vegan diets for longevity. When it comes to longevity, if you want to put a named diet out there and say, what's the best way to do it? What diets seem to have the best track record in terms of just overall health and living a long, healthy life? A vegan or vegetarian or generally plant-based diet is often one of the three that gets put out there as a really viable candidate. That's not because it's not because all animal-based foods are inherently unhealthy. It's just one diet pattern that, if you put it together well, it often involves a lot of vegetables, a lot of fruits, a lot of fiber, a lot of legumes. It avoids a lot of people's vices, so to speak, especially, processed meats, charred meats on the grill, things that generally are associated with some degree of chronic health risk. So vegan and vegetarian, just generally plant-based diets, usually are one of the three that do great in the research available so far. The other two, one of them is the Mediterranean diet. There's some really great data on the Mediterranean diet, which of course it does include animal products. And then the third one that does really well is the DASH diet, which was originally developed for people with hypertension to alleviate hypertension and try to get blood pressure back into a normal range. So the main focus of that diet was to reduce blood pressure, but it tends to be a pretty solid, relatively low-fat diet, a lot of fibrous fruits and vegetables, things like that. But it does include, you could do a vegetarian DASH diet, or you could do an omnivorous DASH diet. So I think vegan diets and other plant-based diets are viable options for longevity. You're not sacrificing anything necessarily in terms of health and longevity, but it's certainly not the only way. And my bias, of course, is that I've been vegetarian, verging on vegan for years now, but I also like science and I like looking at the data. So I'm not going to just support my own bias and say, hey, everyone should eat that way, because the research really doesn't bear that out. Lauren, any strong feelings on dairy and diets for longevity?
No, I think you pretty much covered it.
All right, Lauren, I'm curious to see what you think about this one. I'm going to throw this one to you, and if you don't like it, you can throw it right back. Grass-fed versus grain-fed beef. I know that you are a protein researcher. The lab where you did your PhD, always doing research on different kinds of proteins. I remember there was stuff on certainly, you guys have done stuff, even before you were there, that lab has done stuff with, I think potato protein, pea protein, all sorts of different dairy-based proteins, probably beef and egg at some point as well. A lot of different protein sources being studied there. So what do you think about grass-fed versus grain-fed beef? Do you think that there is a massive advantage for one versus the other? Is it really worth it? And then if you want to touch on this one as well, there's always the debate on fresh caught versus farm-raised fish. So as someone who has spent more time than is appropriate just kind of obsessing about protein questions, where do you stand on those two debates?
So when it comes to the actual protein content, that's not really the main factor when we're comparing these. So just to put some context around this, grass-fed beef, typically the cattle are, roaming free, eating grass as they wish. And then depending on the region where you are, if it's a grain-fed cattle, sometimes they're grass-fed for a period of time and then they're fed grains for another period of time, or sometimes they're fed grains for, their whole life before they're slaughtered. And typically that's a short period of time. So it's kind of inducing weight gain at a faster rate so that, they can produce more beef. And as far as I know, the major difference is the fat content, and then the downstream effect of that is the lipid profile, so saturated fatty acid content, and your polyunsaturated fatty acid content. But the major distinction is that grass-fed beef is leaner than grain-fed beef. Even when you look at your, lean or extra lean grain-fed, it's still typically not going to be as lean as the grass-fed beef. So, and then of course the other thing to consider when we're looking at fat content is overall calorie content. So to the extent that that's important to you, especially if you're in a cutting phase, there's also preference as well. Some people really hate super lean red meat, and some people really like it. So I think there's a few things to consider. But in terms of the protein content or the overall viability of it as being fairly nutritious, I think they're both viable options, but just do be aware that if you are consuming like a medium kind of fat ground beef, you might be looking at maybe 70%, correct me if I'm wrong, a fat 70%, meaning like 30% fat content, versus with some of the grass-fed, you can be looking at like 5% fat content. So that's a pretty substantial difference. And if you're eating that regularly, then you need to be mindful of that just in terms of the overall fat consumption in your diet.
Yeah.
Should I pause there to let you weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I totally agree. The one caveat I would throw in there, I know a lot of bodybuilders, they're very particular about when they buy their beef, buying a particular fat percentage. They'll and you can really customize that. Even with grain-fed beef, they'll still sell it in packages, some that are very, very lean, because once you're processing it, you can adjust that, So I would say you're totally correct that if you're just kind of saying, hey, I'm going to go eat one cow and it's, grass-fed versus grain-fed, the total fat content, that's going to be a substantial difference for sure. But when it comes to, for a given, let's say you're going 80% beef from one and the other, that's where, for me, you're going to see a lot of articles out there saying there's these massive differences in, the percentage of saturated versus monounsaturated fat, or the omega-3 content, or the content of certain fat-soluble vitamins. And for my money's worth, I think that those differences tend to be pretty overblown. I don't reject that they exist. I just also don't see grass-fed or grain-fed beef as being like just a killer rock solid source of like omega-3 fatty acids. It's kind of, do you have a little bit or a smaller percentage of a little bit for a lot of those differences that people tend to hype up a lot. So for my money's worth, back when I was a beef eater, I didn't really care to go for one or the other. I think nutritionally there are distinctions, but not necessarily meaningful differences in the grand scheme of things. So at that point, it just becomes, a question of what do you like better in terms of flavor? What do you, feel more comfortable buying? Maybe there's an ethical element to it. I'm not entirely certain. I've been out of the beef game for a while, but that's just my 2 cents. But I am curious what you're thinking about fish as well.
Yeah, and certainly a cost difference too.
Oh, yeah, big time.
So
yeah.
If you're eating a lot of it, it really adds up.
Yeah.
In terms of the farm versus wild caught fish, To my knowledge, they are both really good sources of your EPA and DHA. And so, really, uh, there are papers that will say wild caught salmon it has the potential for more contaminants, but typically the level of those contaminants are not something to be concerned about. So while that might be there, is it practically relevant? I'd say probably not. Again, you have an issue of difference in fat content typically. So if you're looking at a farm raised salmon versus a wild caught salmon, I mean, you can even see it when you're looking at them next to each other in the store. One of them is a higher fat content than the other, and so you need to be mindful of that in the overall context of the fat content in your diet and the calorie content in your diet. But otherwise, they're both really excellent sources of omega-3s and nutritious food sources.
Yeah, and I'm looking at an article here, saying wild-caught salmon, you're talking 39 milligrams of calcium. Farmed, you're talking 10 milligrams of calcium. But again, it kind of gets back to my point of like, for your fish specifically, are you super worried about getting 4% of your daily calcium versus 1%? With iron, are you worried about getting 6% of your daily value versus 2%? Those are the kinds of differences that we're seeing there. And it becomes another thing for me where I'd be much more likely to make that decision based on, like you said, cost or any kind of ethical elements that could be at play versus, micronutrients or, fatty acid profiles. That's kind of how I would approach making those decisions.
Yeah, it's I'd sort of liken it to when you see these fortified products like milk or bread, and they say, oh, it's fortified with a certain vitamin or extra calcium, etc. But or iron, but it's by such a small amount that you shouldn't be looking to get your iron from your bread. Like, eat iron-rich foods to get your iron.
Yeah, definitely. People in the chat raving over the idea of mass merchandise. People want merch. So folks, drop in the chat what you want. We want hats, hoodies, t-shirts, jeggings. Do people still do jeggings, Lauren?
I would maybe some like bedazzled mass jeggings.
Yeah, we have a friend in the clothing industry, so we could make a lot of different things happen. So let us know what you guys want in the chat, and we will give it consideration. Okay, a question here from Red Scorpio 55. If you kept the same knowledge you have now, but you got 20 years younger, so, okay, yeah, that works. Do you think your progress toward your peak in terms of your gains would have been more linear than it was in real life? So if you just went back 20 years with the knowledge you have now, would your fitness journey be a lot more linear, and would your gains be expedited? My answer to that is simple: yes, by a lot. I would have made a lot better choices. I would have excelled more in my athletic endeavors, no question. And I probably would not be going to physical therapy right now to fix all the stupid things that I did. What about you, Lauren?
I think that's an obvious answer, but I'll counter with, do you have the same enthusiasm that you did at that time? And if you just knew everything and there wasn't those periods of exploration or excitement about new programs that may have been a waste of time, or new supplements that may have been a waste of money, would you have been able to maintain that enthusiasm for the gym and that commitment to lifting regularly? Because as we talk about all the time, that's really important. Even if you're not doing everything optimally, quote unquote, the fact that you're doing it consistently is going to get you those results.
No, I mean, those certainly were the days, no question about that. I yearn for the days when I would walk into a supplement store and be like, something in here holds the key to what I'm missing, right? And back in the day, the pre-workout wars were just crazy. I'm thinking like 2011, 2012, people were just really bringing it. And I remember thinking, oh, if I switch from pre-workout X to pre-workout Y, maybe this is that thing that's going to really make my next mesocycle substantially more effective. And like now I look back at the products and they both suck and they're virtually identical. Everyone in the industry was basically using the same general approach to formulation. And that was even back when consumers didn't even really bother. Like companies felt no pressure to actually tell you what was in it. They would just kind of give you the proprietary blend and say, there's caffeine and other stuff. Don't worry about it. Give it, try a tub and see if you like it. But anyway, yeah, those were the days. It was so much fun to have that somewhat misguided optimism every time you made a little change. So yeah, it's a good point. That stuff is really big. It was enough to kind of push you through your next program and really get your best effort and all your enthusiasm from it. But I also think if I were doing things a little bit smarter, I probably would have had less of that enthusiasm, but more of the enthusiasm that comes with making big strides toward goals. So it very, very different types of enthusiasm for sure. So yeah, it's hard to say, but there have been many times where I felt like, man, if I could go back, especially with wrestling, I'm like, man, my wrestling career could have gone certainly better if I knew then what I know now, because wrestling is one of those sports where like you can do catastrophically stupid things with your diet, your hydration, and what you're doing the 48 hours before competition. I used to think, oh, I'm not going to use the sauna to cut weight. I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. And the result of that was I basically trained like a marathon runner on Thursdays and Fridays for my Saturday strength and power sport, which is extremely stupid, So like, yeah, wrestling is one of those things where you'd make better choices about your weight class selection, how you make weight, what you do on Sunday so that you don't balloon up over your weight limit. But anyway, look at me. If you're on YouTube, I got this beautiful sunset behind me. My life turned out great. What more could I want,
You're living the dream.
Yeah, I've got a lighthouse behind me, beautiful pink purple sun, a little bit of orange in there. So would it have potentially been more linear? Sure. Would I want to go back? No. I did not like being 13. It wasn't as fun. All right.
Just a transition from where you are with the wrestling. We will go back, but there is a question here about programming lifting for someone who wants to improve their wrestling or grappling. So maybe now would be an appropriate time to address that.
Yeah, good call. If I was interested in programming to get good at wrestling and grappling, I think it is very valuable. Not everything in your program has to be purely exercise or sport specific, but it is it's valuable to look at the physiological demands of the sport and say, am I at least including some things in my training that really target those physiological challenges or capabilities that I'm trying to develop? So in a lot of ways, you're doing pretty standard athlete stuff, right? You want to do modified versions of explosive Olympic lifts, because a huge part of wrestling is, can you lift someone approximately your size and return them to the mat with control so that you're not just kind of slamming them down, but you're actually setting up for your next move to actually score some points. Of course, wrestling compared to other sports, you tend to have a little bit more back and shoulder work. The back and shoulder work is part for performance and part for mitigating some injury risk, because I've never seen a wrestler who regretted having stronger and more robust shoulders. The shoulder is essentially designed the way you would design. It's like a bad practical joke. Like the shoulder is not made well. I hate to say it, but it's just kind of sitting there in this really shallow glenoid fossa. It moves way too much, way too much range of motion. So shoulders are a really vulnerable joint. So wrestlers tend to hit those hard, and for good reason. You can't do everything to eliminate the risk of shoulder injury, but like I said, I've never heard a wrestler who regretted, taking some time to really strengthen their shoulder in a variety of different planes of motion. Back work for sure, neck work big time. Wrestling, the two biggest differences to me for training for wrestling and grappling, more grip work, more neck work. Those go a really, really long way. And then outside of the weight room, when you transition into more conditioning-oriented stuff, when I was a strength coach working with wrestlers, we did a decent amount of circuit training. Now, that was not our main lift of the day. We would do our main lift when we were a little bit more fresh. But after that, sometimes we would do some good conditioning circuits where we incorporated even more sport-specific work. So doing snap downs with bands, and maybe even throwing sandbags or throwing dummies that are pretty heavy, but working it in so we're kind of pushing cardiorespiratory fitness with high exertion, high power muscle actions. Because at the end of the day, as a wrestler, that's what it comes down to. Is you are now 5.5 minutes into your match, a minute and a half into the final period, and you need to have a maximal powerful effort to lift and return your opponent to the mat. That takes such a unique combination of strength, power, and endurance that I think circuit training, when incorporated appropriately, can go a really long way there. But again, you're not doing circuit training instead of your traditional weightlifting, because you do need to build up that kind of high-end strength and power. But I like to supplement it with some of that circuit work. And that's all I got.
All right. Just a big shout out to everyone from all over the world in the chat here. We've got Greece, Brazil, France. We're an international office hours going on here. Very exciting.
We're liked basically everywhere except America, which does not bode well for my college football podcast. I don't know.
No one even knows what you're talking about, frankly.
Yeah, I don't know how much college football they watch in Greece or France, but that's fine. No big deal. I will grow my brand and find the Americans who like good old-fashioned sport. Lauren, here's a question for you. Are you up to speed on the frequency literature, resistance training frequency?
Are we looking at from an injury prevention question?
No, I was looking at the question. There's a set of questions from Yuri.
Okay.
Has any study been conducted evaluating the response of performance and hypertrophy using the same daily volume on consecutive days versus alternate days while maintaining the same weekly volume? For example, 18 sets per week for a given muscle group, distributed as 6 sets per day on 3 days. Doing like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday instead of Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Okay, so that's not really a question of frequency. That's just a straight up question of how the frequency is distributed.
How the volume is distributed, rather, right?
Well, both, I guess.
Well, yeah, both.
Are you aware of any studies that actually do that?
No, because that's sort of trying to answer two questions at once, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a difficult one to design, because if I'm just rereading this. So we're doing 6 sets per day on 3 days. So the consecutive days versus the alternate days, you could argue that you would be under recovered on the consecutive days, and therefore you wouldn't gain as much muscle as on the alternate days. But it sort of looks like what does that program look like? Are you doing 3 full body workouts, or are you doing, a push and then a pull and then a legs, and then there probably wouldn't be as much interference in recovery. But to my knowledge, typically when we're doing a volume comparison, it's one volume versus another. Either, you're training one leg one way and then the other leg with the other volume, or you have a higher volume group and a lower volume group. And when we're comparing frequency, then similarly, like, you're just looking at 2 days per week versus 3 days per week. In some studies, they have volume standardized, and in others, they do not. So I have not really seen this question explored in this way.
Yeah. I nothing comes to mind. I'd be stunned if no one has looked at something that's at least applicable to this scenario, but nothing off the top of my head. And the question specifically was looking at the same muscle group. So like the push-pull legs versus full body stuff wouldn't necessarily address this question. But
Right.
but yeah, so this is basically doing bicep curls 6 sets a day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday versus, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for example. Someone must have done that, but I don't know it off the top of my head. Ideally, my intuition says I'd probably go ahead and spread that out if I could, but if consecutive days was the only way to get it in, I'd do it. No big deal. I know back in the day when I was learning about lifting when I was younger, people said, lifting the same muscle group 2 days in a row is the craziest thing you could ever do. It's insane. You're going to induce all this tremendous muscle damage. You'll never recover from it. And that's not true. We have flexibility to do that. It's rarely optimal, in my opinion, to do the same muscle group 3 days in a row. But Zordos used to squat every day for months on end. It was fine. I've done super high frequency programs where I did many instances of consecutive days. If that's the only way for you to get your training in and get a decent amount of volume for the muscle groups you're trying to emphasize, then it's even though it's not the best way always to go about doing it, it's certainly not something that should be avoided like the plague. And back in the day, people talked about it that way, which was not advisable. Yuri, you mentioned that you haven't listened to episode 48 because it's not on Spotify yet. That's crazy. I thought I uploaded that. I'm going to look into that and see what happened. I was pretty sure that I did. But, I'm living a hard life these days. Things get away from me. I could have sworn that. Lauren, have you noticed if I got that up or not? I'll look into that. I appreciate people in the chat holding me accountable and telling me to do stuff. So I'll make sure.
Too focused on college football.
Exactly.
Dropping the ball.
Reading all the recruiting updates. All right. There was another question here. Yes, about doing the same muscle group multiple times in short succession. So Jardar asked, from an injury prevention perspective, how many days should we wait before repeating the same exercise variation within the same rep range? Personally, I don't view this as an injury prevention question. You could have all sorts of different arguments about what is the most effective or advisable way to kind of spread that training out. But I would argue that if doing the same exercise variation days in a row is directly causing you injury, I would say that it's actually an issue of load management. You should be able to build up, if you wanted to, you should be able to build up to a situation where you can confidently bench press every single day. Now, you may not be doing 20 sets of bench press every single day, but you should be able to work up to a sensible combination of intensity and volume where if you wanted to, you could work your way up to that and do it in a manner that's not inherently injurious. Same thing goes for squatting. Insert basically any exercise here. If you are managing your load and your volume progression very appropriately and conservatively, you should be able to do that no problem. Now, having said that, on the practical side, I got that out of the way. All the people who talk about injury on the internet will leave me alone now, right? We're all good. Having said that, from a practical perspective, I do know folks who, they like to push in the gym. And so maybe they aren't taking the most conservative approach to managing their intensity and their volume with certain lifts. And they do notice that if they keep going back to the well more frequently, they say, especially for me, it was always like, oh, if I do too much incline stuff too frequently, that shoulder thing starts bothering me, things like that. In those cases, sometimes it can be helpful. Like there have been times where I did full body training 5 days a week, right? And obviously that's super high frequency. And I did notice because I was pushing the load progressions and volume progressions too hard, some of the pressing stuff would start to bother my shoulder. In those situations, I will acknowledge that it was somewhat helpful to use exercise variety as a tool to get my shoulders moving in different angles, different planes of motion, things like that, to kind of eliminate that. It's almost like when you take off a pair of shoes and you're like, you know everything about your walking stride because you're like, oh yeah, when I walk, I land right there, and you can see how your shoe wears, the wear and tear is kind of uneven, so to speak. I'm going to get in trouble for using wear and tear, talking about lifting and injury stuff. But basically the idea is sometimes, if you say, okay, I know I can do chest 5 days in a row, but maybe if I do incline again today, it's going to potentially bother my shoulders. So I'll mix things up. I'll do a day of incline. I'll do a day of flat. I'll do a day of flies. I'll do a day of dips. I'll move some things around so that I'm not just going back to the same exact motor pattern. And if I am maybe pushing a little too hard, maybe I've got that one little spot that only gets aggravated during this one or two exercises. So I will acknowledge that mixing things around a little bit can practically help you out of a jam sometimes. But generally speaking, I don't think that there is any kind of hard and fast rule to follow there with injury prevention. The biggest thing is just, whenever possible, managing your load progression and volume progression in a way that is actually setting you up for success and not leading you down a road where you feel like you actually need to move away from an exercise to prevent pain or potentially injury. Lauren, I tell you what, I've been blabbing a lot. I want to kick it over to you. Maybe we do one more, perhaps two, and then we'll call it a day. But I want you to get the last word in terms of which questions we address here in the chat.
I'll just add for the injury prevention question that the person did specify within the same rep range, and so that's where I think it can get kind of tricky, because if you're trying to do 1 rep max squatting every single day, I don't know anyone who can do that and sustain that type of program. So that's why typically people who want to squat with a high frequency might have higher rep and lower rep days in their program. So I just think there's a lot of individuality in terms of what you might be able to tolerate in terms of volume and frequency. So experiment with that, but just be mindful that doing the same rep range and doing really high frequency training within that same rep range, you might run into some issues.
Yeah, I think I need to get Mike on here to talk about this, because I'm pretty sure he was doing like conservative 1 rep maxes every day for squat. And personally, I know for me, if they were not true if they were training maxes, not like legitimate RPE 10.5, maximal tests, I would actually feel better with a high frequency program, keeping my loads higher and my volumes lower. Because I know for me personally, just me, if I were, for example, doing super high rep squats every day or super high rep bench pressing every day, it's those high rep sets where I have enough wiggle room to have crappy form, where I'm not keeping everything really tight. Things are getting kind of loose. I've got weird, I'm misgrooving the bar, but not really paying a price for it in the short term. With a 1 rep max, if you misgroove the bar, you're pancaked, you're done. But when you're doing a really hard set of 30, you can actually have some really crappy reps in there where you are moving structures in ways that you're really not accustomed to, because it truly is a novel bar path for you. So I actually feel a lot better doing super high frequency stuff when I'm doing higher load, lower volume. But the big caveat there, to your point, Lauren, is these are very sub-maximal efforts. And if I was doing maximal efforts in that situation, I'd probably be screwed either way, to be totally honest.
Sure. Fair enough. Let's see what we got.
I just want to acknowledge the folks who said that they want bobbleheads of me. That would be a fantastic option. So I will forward that to the powerful decision makers and see what we can come up with.
Sounds good. Bobbleheads and jeggings. That's what you're voting for.
Yeah, someone knew what I was alluding to. They said that we need to get with Omar Esoff, who owns Rascal Apparel, and get some, I think he makes some very stretchy jean shorts. So we would just go with a longer version to get the mass jeggings. And I'm sure that would be very doable.
For winter, yeah, for sure.
All right, you want to find one more and then we'll wrap it up?
Yeah. Do you think it's possible to gain muscle with low testosterone? So this is from Jake. I recently found out I have a testosterone level of 167 and don't want to do TRT and still seem to be making very slow progress in the gym, but was just curious if it's possible to gain muscle with testosterone that low.
Definitely, yeah. But yeah, you go, Lauren, because you're the expert here. I mean,
I know that I'm the testosterone expert, but what I'll say with I have a lot of hormone knowledge, more on the female side, but certainly we have more research on the male side, and so I'm familiar with that as well. And the biggest take home from the literature that has looked at large groups of people and testosterone levels and tried to classify them as normal, that quote normal range is huge. And so what is normal for one person might be really low for another person. So Trex, I know you've talked about when you've done your bodybuilding preps and measured your hormones over time, and then you get down to these really low body fat levels and your T is kind of tanking and you really feel the effects of that. And that's because you started at what was your normal and now you're at a low range. But again, that actual, what that number is, that is the starting point and the ending point, is going to be different depending on the individual. And so if you, Jake, are not experiencing any other sort of side effects, quote unquote, that might go along with being in that low range for you, and as you said, you do think that you're making progress, then I think you're absolutely on the right track. And there's no need to address something unless it actually appears to be problematic. Otherwise, the number is just a number. It's good information. It's good to have the data. Maybe you'll get your blood work done again in 5 years or 10 years, and you'll see if it is stable or if it has started to decline. And then maybe you would make different decisions about addressing that with some sort of hormone replacement therapy. But otherwise, yeah, it's certainly possible to gain muscle.
Yeah, definitely. And I would add to that, like you were saying, Lauren, the range at which low testosterone becomes like quote unquote too low. It's really fascinating. There's some research showing that from one person to another, that number where they start to actually feel symptoms is just dramatically different. So like you were saying, I'm totally on board with all that. Directly to the heart of this question, this is one of those rare, I wouldn't say rare, but it's a particularly, this is an area of research where you might think we have to rely on speculation or, maybe there's no direct research, but there actually is a considerable amount of direct research in this area. And the reason for that, you'd think, well, why in the world would they be doing studies where they artificially suppress testosterone? in resistance trained males. Well, that's a really important part of treatment for prostate cancer. And so there actually are several direct studies showing what happens when you very intentionally take an adult man's testosterone down as low as you can possibly get it and put them through a resistance training protocol. So there's actually a surprisingly large base of evidence to lean on for this question. And cutting to the short version of the answer, individuals do gain muscle mass. They do gain strength on these resistance training programs. It may not be a fully optimized rate of progress. There are dose-dependent relationships between, for example, testosterone levels and hypertrophy in response to training, and even in response to not training. If you give high enough doses of testosterone with no training at all, people will gain muscle. But all that is to say, you don't need testosterone to have a robust response to resistance training. And there are folks with much lower testosterone than the question posed who are making, substantive gains in response to well-controlled resistance training programs. So definitely able to make those gains, even if testosterone's down close to zero.
And testosterone for women is far lower than what your level is. And we still see that women on a relative basis gain a similar amount of muscle in response to the training. So that in and of itself tells us that it's not all about testosterone.
Yeah. All right, Lauren, lovely episode. Anything else you want to address before we wrap things up for the night?
Getting more comments about merch in the chat. And this is something that we've kind of toyed with a little bit, but if you guys really are interested, then do let us know what you might be interested in, and we can certainly look into that. That'd be fun.
And if you're really interested and you want to put your money where your mouth is, you can become an angel investor who props up our merchandise department. So it's a simple arrangement. You put forth all the capital to get production up and running. You manage all of the shipping logistics, probably rent a warehouse for inventory, and we will let you put the mass name on it. And I will also let you use my likeness for bobblehead creation. So if anyone...
They're also requesting a Trex Army stringer.
Yes, probably a Trex Army stringer, and then a Trex Nation flag that you could put out on the front of your house or on the back of your truck.
Yeah, if you are interested in being that angel investor / merch supervisor and logistics manager, then send us a DM to the Instagram at Mass Research Review. Absolutely.
All right, folks. We couldn't get to everything in the chat. Thus is the nature of time. But great episode. Loved having you back on, Lauren. I think we covered some good stuff tonight. And folks, there's always next week. That's how it works with Mass Office Hours. We will be back exactly 1 week from today. That'll be August 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you had a great question, save it up. Bring it next week, and hopefully we'll be able to address it in the chat. Everyone who did contribute questions tonight, thank you so much for doing that. Good questions are what make this show what it is, so thanks so much for your participation. All right, I think that does it. Everyone have an absolutely fantastic week. Take care of yourself, and we will see you back here in exactly 7 days.